Hello and welcome to the Where People Meet podcast, the event technology podcast for the worldwide meetings and events industry. I'm your host, Mitch Malinsky, Head of Strategic Partnerships here at PheedLoop, and today I'm joined by Sara Lieber, Event Marketing Manager at Drift, the leading customer conversational tool for conversational marketing, sales, and service. Drift's mission of going beyond a technology company to being a connection company is one that resonates with me deeply. So much so that we actually employ Drift for things like chatbots and meetings here at PheedLoop, and we absolutely love it. Now, the fun part is that Drift is all about connecting buyers with sellers and empowering experiences that everyone loves, which is pretty awesome if you ask me. Now, what's exciting to me is that Sara has been leading Drift's event marketing division since joining the company back in June of 2021. Between this role and her previous positions in the events industry, Sara has amassed a wealth of experience that we've got the privilege to tap into today. So Sara, just want to start off by saying thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Mitch. I'm really excited to be here and to dive in.
Amazing. Well, where are you calling in from?
I am joining from Boston, Massachusetts. Thankfully, the heat wave is taking a little bit of a break, so it's been a bit easier to get around, less sweating going from A to B.
Yeah, we're not too far from you. We're up in Toronto, and it has been hot and humid and sticky up here, but I love that kind of heat. But I'm glad to hear that it's ebbing off for you. So Sara, let's dive in. Let's start with you telling everyone a bit about yourself, your background in the meetings and events industry.
Sure. So if I'm going to be completely honest, I didn't always start in events and the meetings industry. I have a background in hospitality administration management, which I got at Boston University, so have been in Boston ever since. I started primarily in the restaurant industry, so similar to kind of an area of Drift being service. So providing a different kind of service in the restaurant space. That took me out of the restaurant into corporate doing marketing management at a restaurant group. So similar kind of event aspect, but more so focusing on the different restaurants within our group and their presence at offsite events. That journey led me to working with an event agency. So I had the pleasure of doing many different types of events for many different types of clients, which then eventually led me here to Drift, where I get to focus and kind of combine both of my past experiences with restaurant event marketing and event planning to do event marketing at Drift.
That's a really exciting journey. A lot of experiences. I can see how they're fairly complementary and have led to some of the successes we've seen. So that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Now, one item I want to pick your brain on, Sara, is how the industry has changed over the past couple of years. So it's no secret that the events industry was seriously shaken up as a result of the pandemic. And I understand that your team over at Drift, you actually took the pandemic as an opportunity to reflect internally and to look at your organization's event strategy and make changes. It seemed that you actually completely flipped it on its head. These weren't minor changes. It's a complete 360. And I do want to dive into what those changes were later on. But before we dive into those changes, it would be good to hear about Drift's event strategy pre-pandemic. And knowing this was probably slightly before your time at the company, but I imagine you probably got a pretty good sense of what it looked like pre-pandemic.
Sure. So pre-pandemic, we were still in that hyper growth phase, really like growing rapidly. So it was no surprise that we held a biannual conference called Hypergrowth. So this was a large format conference, about anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500 registrations. So definitely up there in the numbers. It was also held towards the end of the year, which was a little bit different. Drift likes to shake things up. So we held one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, both around the same time as Inbound and Dreamforce. So you could imagine being in two very large cities with lots of events going on at the same time. They were very thought leadership focused, one day, one talk track, like one main stage. And it was a nice combination of keynote speakers within like the marketing sales field, like big names. We had Alex Honnold, we had Ali Raisman, the gymnast. So very different areas and talk tracks that you could kind of go down, while also having some of our customers and our partners speak as well to more of like their tools and their tactics within the marketing and sales industry. So they were also just very big, on-brand, fun, creative, multi-experience options to dive into for that one day.
That's great. So it seems as if these were beasts of events to pull off and primarily focused on the content side of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely focused on content. You definitely would show up, kick things off at 9, and then you wouldn't leave there until, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And during the day, options for networking, talking with people, and we had your usual sponsor setup so that you can engage with other companies that might have been there, and sometimes the occasional after party to let loose and have fun. But definitely a jam-packed day.
Yeah, that's a big draw, the after party, of course, can't miss that. But okay, so that's what the portfolio of events for Drift looked like pre-pandemic. Now, let's dive into the changes in strategy that came as a result of the pandemic. What were they, and why did you implement these changes?
Sure. So I think it's no surprise that in March of 2020, gone were the days of 1,000+ people conferences. Nobody was joining in person. Everything was at home. And as I mentioned, our past conferences were held kind of in the fall of every year. So you could imagine in 2019, we had just come off our last event, which was in November. And we were in March of 2020, and, we couldn't just sit there and be like, okay, well, we're not going to do anything until the fall again. Well, we weren't going to stick it out to see if this pandemic would stop. So we did a really quick turnaround, and in about 6 weeks, we did our first virtual event in April of 2020. It was really impactful. It brought in over 6,000 registrations. I think it was somewhere close to even like 8,500 people registered for this event. It was about 3 to 4 hours long. Similar concept with keynote speakers, but a little bit more on the tactical side, bringing in partner speakers and partner keynotes from other companies that Drift works really closely with to provide everybody with, tactical takeaways, while also recognizing that everyone would be joining from the comfort of their home, rather than being grouped together in one room. So inevitably this kind of launched. And after that first event in April, things were so great that it kind of transformed and retrained our thinking. And that birthed our Rev Growth series, which then happened every quarter, which we thought would end in 2020 and then continued on into 2021. So it was definitely a big change and a switch from going to 2 conferences a year, which were very similar in format, to then 4 smaller topic-focused events. So each Rev Growth would have a different topic around it. So Rev Growth for ABM, Rev Growth for virtual events. They each had their own topic that the sessions all focused on, and somewhere or another related back to. So just the overall programming kind of essentially doubled when it came to content, when it came to speakers, when it came to planning, even though we were all doing it from the comfort of our home.
That's a pretty wild success story that you guys saw. It's just jumping up from what I believe you mentioned, 25 to 3,500 people in person at those events to almost 8,000 people registering for the first virtual event. That's incredible. Did that kind of attendance sustain itself through the other Rev Growth series events, or did that even out a bit?
It did. It definitely evened out a bit coming closer to the end of the year. So I think the full year as a whole was pretty consistent. I think, everyone sort of settled into the new norm of attending and getting their content in a virtual format. We definitely saw bigger differences come 2021 as we kind of repeated the same, events programming going into essentially everyone's second year of a pandemic. So 2021 definitely painted a different picture. But it was exciting to see the engagement and figure out different ways and different topics that we could present that would keep people coming back for more.
That's great. And you mentioned something that I quickly want to highlight for the listeners. That is that you leaned on some of your partners, some of the organizations that you're working alongside and collaborating with to drive and drum up hype for the event. I believe you mentioned you'd bring in CEOs and executives from some of these companies to do webinars, breakout sessions, keynote presentations. That way you can tap into their audience, help build up hype for the event, and then also recognize them as a partner. That's actually a strategy that we take with some of the events that we produce here at PheedLoop. It's a strategy that a lot of our clients take, and listeners in the audience, I would urge you, if you do have partners, if you do have organizations that you work with, get creative, see what ways you can involve them at your next event. I think it'll return some pretty awesome dividends, both for you and your partners.
Yeah, we can definitely touch on this when we start talking about our current event strategy, but leveraging our partner relationships is super important. We have a couple of different tiers of partnerships here at Drift, whether they're integration partners where our product integrates with theirs, or if they're solutions partners. But you can get creative with so many different ways to work with them, to not only, leverage them to spread the word of your event, but to also highlight, what they're doing at their companies and how it might be useful to your audiences.
Exactly. It's win-win for everyone. Yeah. All right. So diving back into the changes that you made, it seems that the goal was to take the concept of experiential marketing that you tout at your organization and to instill that in the events that you're running. So instead of running 2 broadly focused events each year in which the goal was to position Drift as a thought leader in the industry, you are now taking a more tactical and strategic approach in which you're hosting smaller, more targeted, and heavily focused events, but more often. Now, I know event strategies are long-term, and this is a fairly recent initiative that you've implemented, but what are the results that you've seen so far? Do you think this has been a success? Are there any drawbacks? Would love to hear about that.
Sure. I think one of the hardest things that everyone has had to overcome moving their events to a virtual format is what first of all, you have to ask yourself, what makes a virtual event different from a webinar? Because webinars were around before the pandemic, and now you have to decide. And that was something we had to look at too. Like, what does a webinar format look like compared to a virtual event format, and how close together could they get without, blending into the same thing? And I think with that, you then also have to look at, what are you providing your attendees with? So, that's why we went down the route of being more tactical. So a lot of our content now is very, you can take away so many different nuggets of information when you come to these events. And it's not just sitting there listening to people talk at you or reflect on their previous successes. We make sure that the events are structured in a way that you're able to jot down a few notes or take these items back to your teams and implement them. And on the engagement piece, making sure that you're able to create a multidimensional experience. So giving, paying more attention to that networking piece, and allowing them to talk with your speakers or talk with other attendees, has really helped us to not only, see conversations happening during the event, but has allowed our teams to have conversations with these attendees, which then, of course, increases our meetings booked. It creates continuous content and touch points for us to reach out to people. So it's kind of like events are the gift that keep on giving. They are a huge pipeline driver for us over here at Drift, but being able to get creative, and I think just increasing the frequency has also been great because it gives our sales team something to look forward to, or like I said, be a talking point when they're in conversation. And then we touched a little bit about strengthening the partner relationships because you can engage them in more events, but it also strengthens our customer relationships, because we can show customer solution sessions or, allow our customers to share their story, which is another great way to show your tool, not just by talking about it, but having someone else talk about it to say how much Drift has helped them. And then it doubles down and helps, extend and strengthen that relationship with the customer for the long term.
Yes. I actually experienced that firsthand a couple of weeks ago. I was invited to Gong. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gong, but it's
their reality roadshow.
Yes. So they did the reality roadshow. I was invited to one of the dates in Toronto, and it was clearly a sales event. But you come to the event. It's a small venue. It's only about 50 people. And they treat you really well. There's a nice cocktail reception. You sit down for a very nice dinner. And then they just have a couple of presentations on stage where it's not a member of the Gong team coming up on stage and being like, this is why Gong is awesome, and just trying to shove it down your throat. Instead, they were bringing their customers and they were interviewing their customers on how they implemented Gong, what the state of their sales looked like pre-implementation, and the changes that have happened since then. So it was really valuable for me to hear that firsthand. Now, that was a couple of weeks ago. We have yet to implement Gong, but I am actually actively looking into it. It was a really good event, and using customers to share stories, I think it's a bit more credible than just you coming on stage or a member of your company coming on stage and listing off the reasons as to why you guys are awesome. So firsthand experience, that approach works really well.
It's almost similar to most people when they go online to buy something, they're looking at the reviews of something. So if you can bring that experience to life by having your customers give real life reviews on stage in front of your audience, and then potentially have the opportunity to talk with that person firsthand and maybe, ask them a couple of questions or, it accelerates, the thought process and the contact piece of it. So
for sure,
definitely something we love to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good approach. And it seems as if this flip of your event strategy overall has been a really big success. But I imagine there were complications, as with implementing any new big project like this. So are there any lessons learned? Are there any failures that you can spotlight for the audience?
I was going to say, how much time do we have? Always so many lessons. I'm, call me an optimist. Definitely we've had some failures, but I always say that you'll never know unless you fail. So you can't learn from what you've done. If you've done everything right your whole life, then there's nothing else to get creative with or try something new. So failures are always a good thing, although scary. I think one of the biggest things that we took away from it, and I think, we're still recovering a bit from it, is the crunch time for planning. I mentioned, obviously, we went from November of 2019 with our last in-person event. Usually, you take a break, the holidays come, and then we're back in March, and we weren't expecting to do an event, and we had to instantly stop what we were doing and say, all right, we got to put something together in 6 weeks. And that's not just put together content, get speakers, that's promotion, that's outreach, to let everybody know that this event's happening in April and we want them to join. So, leaving as much time for planning as possible, because then we were in a cycle that we had just had one event, but then we needed to plan again to get prepared for the next event that was happening in the next quarter. So definitely making sure your teams are aligned and you have a plan schedule of what needs to happen when. I think another lesson that we learned is in terms of the planning schedule, we were all working remote. So it wasn't easy to go over to your colleague's desk and be like, hey, let's talk about this. You had to align schedules. You had to set up Zoom calls, a lot less in-person face-to-face time, and a lot more trying to maneuver this new work life. So with that, I would say just be patient. And make sure that you and your teams have open communication, whether it's Slack. We use Asana here at Drift to help manage projects. And even taking the time to roll out new processes and procedures of, how things get planned. When it comes to the event itself, technology definitely was continually advancing. So for your virtual events, making sure that you had a platform that worked well with what you wanted to do. A lot of our content we had decided would be pre-recorded. Again, trying to schedule everyone to be on a Zoom or wherever your event was streaming at one given time was not going to happen with the pandemic. So making sure that you set up the time to pre-record, that your editing team had time to edit it, but then also that your platform was able to handle your pre-recorded videos. And that leads me to my next one, which is rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Even though it's a virtual event, make sure you set the time to run through that event 3, 4, 10 times before the actual event to make sure everything is flushed out. And I think, ironically, that's almost a benefit to virtual events, is that you can do that. Whereas in-person events, it was just one and done. And now we do have a little bit more time to kind of reflect and watch things before they do go live.
This is great. So what I'm hearing is ensure you're giving yourself and your team enough time to plan, execute, and debrief from the event. Equip yourselves with the appropriate tech stack for your goals and objectives. And as you said, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Practice it as much as you can. Iterate it. You can always get better. That's those are some really good points. Thank you for that, Sarah. Now, let's tie something fun into this. Drift's slogan is everything starts with a conversation. And I love that. That's really catchy. It's really straightforward. It gives me an understanding of what your company is about and what you do. But how does this slogan play into and drive your event marketing strategy, if at all?
Sure. So this everything starts with a conversation tagline is kind of new. It was launched back with our brand relaunch in March of this year. But, we had launched in March. We now have the Conversation Cloud, which is composed of conversational sales, conversational marketing, and conversational service tools that you can enable your whole team. At its core, Drift is a chatbot. That's kind of how the company was founded, conversational marketing. So it's only natural that, anything you do, whether you're buying something, whether you're selling something, everything has to start with a conversation. So I think we kind of take that and embody it as like, how can we start conversations? How can we continue conversations? How can we brighten conversations through the power of our events? And it's actually funny. I was just at a conference and we were sponsoring and we had a booth and, we had our brand colors and our logo up on the wall. And there was one tagline. It just said, everything starts with a conversation. And someone came up to me and said, everything starts with a conversation. That's not enough information to tell me what you do. What do you do? And I was like, well, you just started a conversation based off of that one-liner. I'd be happy to tell you what Drift does. So it kind of like played on itself, but it was the perfect example of everything, whether she wanted to know where I got my shoes, whether she wanted to know, what my favorite color was, or whether she wanted to learn more about Drift. You can't know unless you start a conversation.
Sums it up perfectly. That's a great example. Now, I know you've already shared some of your lessons learned from this pivot that you did back at the start of the pandemic, but drilling down into your focus on experiences and the transition that you made from content-heavy events to events that are really centered around experiences. What we love to do with this podcast is provide some tips and tricks, actionable insights that the listeners in our audience can implement if they choose to adopt that in their event strategy. So for those listening today who do want to change their event strategy to be more experiential, to more of a focus on conversations, what are your recommendations for them to do so?
Sure. So I think kind of tying back my experience to the restaurant industry and my earlier years in the hospitality industry, I love taking events, especially in this new virtual era, as we slowly dip our toes back into in-person. I love making the engagement and events kind of multi-sensory. So figuring out ways that you can include not only things that people can see, things people can hear. Those are, two things off the bat that you'll get from a virtual event. But how can you go above and beyond to maybe send them a gift so that they can touch something? Maybe you send them lunch so that they can have lunch while they're watching your webinar. Figuring out ways to tap into the other senses so that they're fully engaged in the event that you're putting on. It could also be something simple where you send a follow-up and it's, a candle, a gift, whatever it might be. You have that touch point after the event, which continues the conversation that you've already started with them at your event. So I love a good multi-sensory experience. I think with that as well is do your research to understand your audience. So as we dove into the rev growth era back in 2020 and 2021, really understanding what your audiences were looking for when it comes to tactical takeaways, you can then tailor your event content to be more specific. And then you can also tailor your event outreach to those audience to say, hey, we have something that you're really going to enjoy and you're really going to want to take and implement in your companies, which kind of touches on Drift's personalization, where you can get really personalized in how you talk to your buyers when they're coming to your website. So making sure you tap into that. And then I think, as people start to go out to in person, again, making sure you're meeting your audience where they are. So, you mentioned Gong's event. They came up to Toronto, which is where you were. Travel is still very hit or miss with certain people and audiences. So trying to eliminate one of those barriers to entry to your event and going to either more cities or a city that's more populated with your target audience kind of just takes the stress off of them actually attending and is likely to have a greater return on your event, which again then just continues the conversation down the road.
These are some really good tips. We'll definitely highlight them in the show notes for those listening. But Sara, we're wrapping this up here. I know I've taken a lot of your time, so just want to say thank you very much for being so generous with your time. This was a really engaging conversation for me. I learned a lot from you. You do a terrific job of marketing Drift, your events. Let me know when the next ones are coming up. I'm not sure whether they're still virtual, in person, what it is that you're looking at going forward, but they seem like awesome events and I'd love to attend one. But for those in the audience who want to learn more from you and connect with you, what's the best way to do so? Are you on LinkedIn? Do you have social media? Where can they follow you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Mitch, so much for having me. This has been awesome. And I would love to, we started the conversation, so I'd love to keep it going with anyone who's listening. You can find me on LinkedIn, Sara Lieber. I always joke that my last name is spelt like Justin Bieber, except with an L. So Lieber. I also am very happy to connect over email. So you can email me at slieber@drift.com. Happy to answer any questions or just talk with like-minded, event planners out there that want to keep the conversation going.
Love it. Well, we'll drop all of that in the show notes so it's easy to find. But again, Sara, thank you for your time. Listeners, that wraps up our Where People Meet podcast on turning events into experiences with Sara Lieber from Drift. Thanks for your time today, and we'll see you next time on the Where People Meet podcast.